This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, we'll get started. In last class, day before yesterday class, we were discussing about node selector, node affinity, and we were discussing about pod affinity, pod anti affinity. And we have a few more concepts. Taints and tolerations, cardon, drain, and uncardon. So we already discussed about this node selector, node affinity, and pod affinity, pod anti-affinity, what is soft limit, what is hard limit. Now let's continue with what do you mean by taints and what do you mean by tolerations here. So taint is a property on the node which mark, we using taints we can mark that node as not schedulable. So taint is a property on the node. We can taint any node unless until your pods are tolerating that taints. Does that pods will be allowed to get scheduled on that node? No. So taint is a property on the node. Taint is a property on the node which will repel the pods to get scheduled on that node. So node affinity is a property of a pod that will attract the pods to the nodes. Does node affinity will attract the pods? Does node affinity will attract the pods to the nodes? Node affinity or node selector? Yes. So node affinity is a property of a pod that will attract them to set of nodes. Taints are opposite. Node affinity is a property of a pod that will attract them to the set of nodes, but the taints are opposite to that. So they will repel set of pods. They will allow node to repel. The taints will allow a node to repel set of pods. What do you mean by repel? The node will repel. The node will reject. The node will reject the pods. Unless until the pods are tolerating that taints, does node will repel that pods or reject that pods to get scheduled? If I am using a taints concept, yes. So taint is a property of a node that will allow you to repel set of pods unless that pods explicitly tolerates that taint. Taint has three pods. Key, value, and effect. Taint has a three pods: key, value, and effect. Key, value, and effect. Key and value can be anything, guys. Key and value can be anything. Anything you can use as a key and anything you can use as a value. But what are the possible effects we can use when I am tainting any node? We have three possible effects. One is no schedule. Another one is prefer no schedule. Another one is no execute. The possible effects here when I am tainting any node: no schedule, prefer no schedule, no execute. When I say no schedule, it will not schedule a pod. Kubernetes or that node will not allow to schedule a pod without the matching toleration. Unless until the pod tolerates this taint with that effect, does that pod get scheduled on the node wherever I have tainted using this property? No. So no schedule will not allow pod unless until that pod is tolerating that taint. Prefer no schedule. It's kind of a soft rule, softer version of no schedule. Prefer no schedule. It is kind of a softer version of that no schedule. It will not prefer to schedule, but it may allow. That is a soft version of no schedule. What do you mean by no execute? I can taint any node with no execute. So it will evict the pods. It will evict. It will evict the pods that doesn't have a matching tolerations. So what does it mean? What do you mean by evicting? When I taint any node with this no execute effect, what do you mean by evicting? Madhu is saying rebooting. Evicting is different. It is evict in the sense vacating. It is going to remove. Evicting. It is going to remove that pods. Remove that pods which are not tolerating that taints. What do you mean by this? Let me explain pictorially so that it will be easy for you to understand. Now let's consider these are my nodes. These are my Kubernetes nodes. Already, do I have a master with some taint? Do I already have some master with some taints? Master node already has a taint. Now when I am scheduling any pods, I am not tolerating that taint. This master has a taint like this. Let me connect to my Kubernetes master and show you. Let me connect to my Kubernetes master where I have a kubectl. So if you see, now if you see this master, one of the node master has a taint. It is basically key three values, key, value, key, value, and effect. But they have not given any key. This is value and this is effect. So my master node has already one taint. That master node already has a taint. This master node has a taint. So this is the taint on the master. Now when I am scheduling any pods, is master is allowing that pods to get scheduled in this? Is this node is allowing that pods to get scheduled unless until my pod is tolerating this taint? Is this master is allowing? No. It is rejecting. It is repel. It is going to repel. Repel in the sense reject. So if my pod tolerates this taint, then it will allow. Otherwise, it will reject. So that's why it is going on these nodes. Now, here we have a three effects: no schedule, prefer no schedule, no execute. Let's say I already scheduled some pods. Already some pods are running in this node. Let's say later I added a taint. Maybe like this, anything, any key, any value, any value like this, and effect. I am using this effect. Now I added a taint like this. After some time, already some parts are running and I added a taint like this. What will happen to the existing parts if I add a taint with this effect? What will happen to the already running parts in that node? Will it continue to run if I add a taint with this effect? Will it continue to run existing parts? Will it continue to run? Yes. Existing parts will continue to run. But does any new parts get scheduled unless until that part tolerates this taint? Is existing parts will continue to run. Existing parts will continue to run. But will it allow any new parts unless until the pod is tolerating this effect, taint? No. So existing parts will continue to run, but any new parts, I am trying to deploy a new pod, and that pod does this node will allow that pod if that pod is not tolerating this taint? No. Existing pods will continue to run. But with this effect, if I try to add a taint, what will happen? With this effect, if I add a taint, what will happen to the existing pods? Any pods which are already existed in that one? What it does? What do you mean by this here? If I use that one, pod eviction. Pod eviction. What do you mean by pod eviction? Is it going to remove that pod from that node? But if it is tolerating that effect also, is it going to remove? Suppose this pod is tolerating that effect. Suppose it is tolerations. In tolerations, it is tolerating this effect. Is it going to remove that pod? No. If that pods are not tolerating that effect, is that existing pods gets removed from that node, evicted from that node? Yes. So that is no execute. That is no execute. Now, can I add a taint on any node? Not on, by default, master has a taint. Can I add a taint on any node also? Yes. So you can add a taints on any node. So by adding a taint, can I allow only specific parts to get scheduled on that node by tolerating that taint? By adding a taint, is it possible to schedule only specific parts by tolerating the taint? Yes. Node can have multiple taints. Node can have multiple taints. If any pod is to be scheduled on that node, you need to tolerate all the taints. Now, taint is a property on the node. We can add a taint. What do you mean by tolerations? Nodes are tainted for some reason to avoid pods. Toleration is simply a way to overcome a taint, which means if I tolerate the taint, does again that node will allow that pods, whatever pods which are tolerating the taint? Yes. So taint is a property on the node, but these tolerations where I need to use, do I need to use these tolerations in my pod while scheduling a pod in my pod manifest? Do I need to use these tolerations? Yes. Now I can add any taint and I can tolerate that taint in my pod manifest, right? So if you have this type of use cases, you can use these taints and tolerations. Now how to add a taint, as I already told, how to add a taint like this. This is the syntax. This is the syntax like this. Taint node name, whatever node you want to add a taint. Let's say I want to add a taint on this 93 node. Let's say I want to add a taint on this 93 node. That node name, key and value, any key, any value. Here can I give ABC XYZ? This instead of node, instead of head pods, can I use ABC equals to XYZ also? Yes. But some meaningful name you can use. But what is this possible effects? Only 3. Now I can add a taints like this. I can add a taint like this. Now before tainting that node, let's see if any pods are running on that node. If any pods are running on that node in any namespace. Now I think in default namespace. In default namespace, 93. Do I have this pod running? Already one pod is running. As of now, is that 93 node has any taint? Is that 93 node has any taint as of now? Do I have any taints on that node, 93 node? No. Now let's say I am adding a taint with this effect. I already have one pod. I already have one pod running on that node. I already have one pod. You can see here also when I am describing that node also I can see this pod is running in that node. Now if I describe that pod or if I describe that deployment, whatever it is used, Do you see, is it tolerating anything? Describe deployment. I want to describe deployment. Describe deployment, the deployment name. Now, is it tolerating anything? If you want to see in a YML format, instead of describe, you can see kubectl get deployment name -o YAML format. If you see, is it tolerating anything? As of now, do I have that pod spec with any tolerations? No. Now it is not tolerating anything. Now if I add this taint with this effect, what will happen to the pod, existing pods which are running? What will happen to this pod which is running? Let me add the taint. Now when I describe that node, 93 node, now can I see that a taint? Can I see that a taint now? Whatever I have added. Now let me get the pods. Now, is there any impact on the existing pod, whatever it is already running with this effect, no schedule? Now, for some reason that pod is deleted. Again, the new pod will get scheduled on that node, 93 node, unless until you are not tolerating that one. No. You are trying to create another deployment or same deployment, you are trying to update, or let me intentionally delete. Now I'm intentionally deleting that pod. Now does that pod get scheduled on that 93 node? Now it is not getting scheduled in 93. And why it is not scheduled in any other nodes also? Maybe you might be using different things here, because of maybe resources, because of maybe node selectors or pod affinity, pod anti-affinity. But why it is not considering 93? Because 93 has a taint now. Now if you see in my pod manifest, whatever I have used, maybe not sure which one I have used. I've used maybe pod anti-affinity, this one. In my pod manifest, am I using any tolerations here in my pod spec? So that's why it is not scheduled. Now to demonstrate easily, let me delete all these applications. Now you deploy any pod, any application. Let's deploy any pod, any application, whether it's a deployment, whether it's a daemon set, that doesn't matter. Whether it's a deployment, whether it's a daemon set, that doesn't matter. Any application, that can be Java application, that can be Python application, whatever it is. Now let's say any application you deploy, is that pod gets deployed in that node, whatever node I have it tainted, because this here I am not tolerating? No. Now if I tolerate the taint, then it will deploy. Now let me show you, without tolerating, I am trying to deploy some application like this. Maybe 2 replicas, 1 replica, that doesn't matter. Now let me create a 2 replicas. Any application, that doesn't matter here. Now I think in test namespace I used kubectl get all -n test ns. Now one is in running state, another one is in pending state. Even though it is running, why it is showing 0 by 1? We already discussed, because here I am using all those concepts, that liveness probe, readiness probe, all these concepts are there, right? So that's why it is performing health check. But why it is only one pod is running, why other pod is in pending state? kubectl get pods -o wide -n test -ns. This pod is running in 206 because of health checks. It is not showing completely ready. After performing that health check, it will show one by one. It will show one by one. But why other one is in pending state? Let's describe. Let's describe that pod. This other pod which is in pending state. 0 by 3 nodes are available. 0 by 3 nodes are available. One node has an insufficient CPU. One node has insufficient CPU. Maybe this node 206 have an insufficient CPU because I am requesting 500 millicore. Already some pods are running, some pods requested some CPU. I don't have enough CPU in 206. What about other two nodes? What about another two nodes? One node has a taint, that is master node has a taint, and also the worker node, other worker node also do have a taint. Now master node has taint and other worker node has a taint. Is our parts are tolerating the taints? No. Because of that, it is not allowed. Now if I tolerate this one, if I tolerate this one, if I tolerate this one here in my pod manifest, I'm using deployment strategy as recreate so that it will delete and apply. Now here in my pod spec, the way I have a node affinity, node selector, pod affinity, pod anti-affinity, can I do something like this? Tolerations, tolerations, like this. Tolerations. Your key, your operator, your value, your effect. Let's say here there are two possible operators. One is equal, another one is exist. One is equal, another one is exist. So if I want to compare key value, then I can use operator as equal. Operator as equal. Suppose I don't want, I'm least bothered about keys and values. Can I just use only operator and effect also, like just using exists? Just exist. If this effect is exist, yes. So when I want to use key value also I need to use for comparison, then I can use equal. I am least bothered about this key, I am least bothered about that value, I am only bothered about the effect. Any key, any value, I want to tolerate that effect. Then I use operator as exist instead of equal? Yes. You can use exist instead of equal. Now if I want to tolerate based on the key value and effect also, I can use operator as equal, something like this. Key, whatever key, what key I have used, I think node only. Operator, operator can be equal, value, whatever value. I have given value something like this, I guess, hate pods or hates pods. This is value. Effect, no schedule, something like this. Like this, if I have multiple taints also, can I tolerate? Again, suppose I want to tolerate the taint which is there on the master also. Can I do something like this? Key, operator, effect. So in the master, I don't have the value, there is only key, something like this, operator, exist. Is it possible to tolerate like this multiple taints also? Yes. For now, let me tolerate only this one. I am tolerating only this one. I am not tolerating the master. So does still master will allow parts to get scheduled even though I am tolerating this one? Is master will allow? Because I am not tolerating whatever taints I have on the master. So does master will allow? No. But does that worker will allow? That does that worker will allow to get this part to be scheduled there? Yes. Something like this I am tolerating. Now let me apply. Let me apply. kubectl apply. Since it's a deployment, with a deployment strategy as recreate, does existing parts which gets deleted and redeployed new parts even though there is no change in the image tags. Even though there is no change in the image tags, I am just modifying that part template. Any changes to the part template will result in new parts. Now do you see is now it is there in 93 as well as 206 parts got scheduled because I am tolerating whatever taint I have on the master. Yes. So I can taint any node. I can taint any node. Now even though I want to taint multiple, even though I want to tolerate multiple, can I use multiple tolerations as I already told, since this is an array? Or you are least bothered about key and value, can I use something like this? In my tolerations, I want to tolerate whatever it is. Can I tolerate something like this? Instead of I'll not use key, I am least bothered about value. I am only bothered about that effect. Can I tolerate like this also? Operator instead of equal exists like this. Any key, any value, I am least bothered. I want to tolerate this effect also for some ports. Can I tolerate like this also if required? Yes. Is everyone clear? What do you mean by taints? What do you mean by tolerations? Now if required, I want to remove the taint. Is it possible to remove the taint? For some reason, I don't want to taint that node anymore. I don't want to taint that node anymore. Is it possible to remove the taint? Yes. Is it possible to remove the labels also if required on the node? Yes. Now, how to remove? At the end, at the end, at the end, I will use this minus. At the end, I will use this minus. Now, when I use this minus at the end, now, did I get a message saying that untainted? Now, do I have the taints on that node? If I describe that node, will I able to see the taint on that node? 93. Let me describe that node. Now, do I have a taint on that node? No. So this way, you can add a taint and you can tolerate the taints or you can remove the taints. I hope everyone is clear what is taints and what is tolerations. Now next one, what is the another concept we have here is these three: drain, cordon, uncordon. Kind of a maintenance, node maintenance or cluster maintenance. Node maintenance or cluster maintenance. Now I want to, this drain or this cordon can be used for multiple purposes. Let's consider you are having some issue in that node, one of the node. Maybe there is a network failure, there is a storage failure or hardware failure. You have some issue on in one of the node. In one of the node, you have some issues. Now, or you want to upgrade some software versions in that node, or you want to upgrade your Kubernetes versions also. You want to upgrade Kubernetes versions also without impacting your cluster. Without impacting your cluster and your application, you want to upgrade, or there is a issue. Not only just upgrading, there is some issue in one of the node. You don't want your parts to get scheduled on that node. You don't want your parts to run on that node. You want to vacate that parts which is running in that node. I can go for these options. One is cordon. One option is cordon. What do you mean by cordon? If I cordon the node, what will happen? It will make the node as unschedulable. So it will make that node as unschedulable. If I cordon that node, it will make that node as unschedulable. It will mark that node as unschedulable, which means it is not schedulable. that node is not available for scheduling the pods. So whatever node is marked as unschedulable using Cardan, I have marked that node as unschedulable. Does your scheduler will consider that node to schedule the pods? Does your scheduler will consider that node to schedule your any new pods? If I mark some of the node as unschedulable, if I carden some node, does your scheduler will consider that node to schedule any new pods? No. But what will happen to the existing parts if I just carden? If I just carden, what will happen to the existing parts? Will it continue to run? Yes, it will continue to run. So it will continue to run. But then once I mark that node as unschedulable, once I carden, then can I execute a drain? Then can I execute a drain so that it will execute, it will start vacating, it will start evicting the pods, whatever pods which is running on that node. If I drain that node, it will first, instead of directly vacating, the pods, you need to follow some standards. If I am draining that node, it will just vacate the existing pods, but still scheduler will consider that the node is available. The scheduler will still schedule the pods if I just drain. Yes. So that is not the way of doing. You carden the node first. You mark that node as unschedulable. Then can I execute this drain so that whatever pods which is running in that node will get removed from that node. Then can I go for a maintenance activity, version upgrades, or whatever you want to do? Once I do this carden and drain? Yes. Not only for upgrade, let's say there is some issue in that server. Some issue is there, some network failure, some hardware failure is there. I don't want that node to be used by your Kubernetes cluster. So can I carden that node? Can I drain that node so that any new parts will get not scheduled and existing parts will be removed from that node? For that use case also you can use this one. Now let me show that. Now I have some pods running in 93 and 206. I have some pods running in 93 and 206 also. Now let me describe my node. Maybe let me describe this 206 or 93. Now if you see, as of now, what is this value? Unschedulable value. What is that unschedulable value on that node? False. Unschedulable false in the sense, is it schedulable? Unschedulable false in the sense, is it schedulable? Yes. Now for some reason this node is not working as expected, or I want to do some kind of OS patch, or software upgrade like a Kubernetes upgrade I want to do without impacting my existing applications. Now can I drain that node can I carden that node first? Guys, this is very, very important also. As a Kubernetes administrator, you need to understand what do you mean by carden, what do you mean by drain. Carden in Kubernetes, right? As I already told. So if you go to the official website, kubernetes.io, node management or cluster management. Cluster management. A node may be a virtual machine or physical machine depending on your cluster. Each node is managed by control plane, contains the server services necessary to run the pods. We already know all these things. Now here there is a concept called carden, administration. So when you want to create, or when you want to have a maintenance, right, you can carden that node. Marking a node as unschedulable prevents the scheduler from placing the new parts into that node. If I mark any node as unschedulable, will prevent the scheduler to place the new pods on that node. But as I already told, is it going to affect the existing pods on that node? No. But this cardon is useful as a pre-preparatory step, before a node reboot or other maintenance, as a prerequisite. I will mark this node as unschedulable. Something like this, kubectl cardon node as a preparatory step. Now let me do that. kubectl cardon, that node name. Maybe let's cardon this node now. Sorry, CO, not CA, CO, cardon. Now I have cardon that node. Now I just cardon that node. Do you have any impact on the existing parts which is running on that node? No. When I describe this node, now you can see node not schedulable. Now this status is now node not schedulable. Here if you see unschedulable flag, what is the value on that node now? True. Which means, is it available for scheduling the pods? Is this node is available for scheduling the pods? No. But do I have any impact on the existing pods? I just cardon the node? No. Once I cardon this node, can I drain this node? If I execute a drain, kubectl drain, something like this. The way I have executed cardon, after executing a cardon, then I can do the draining process. Like you can understand all these things, whatever it is. Like then I can drain this node. kubectl drain, something like this. Drain. There is a command kubectl drain and that node name. So I can execute that command kubectl drain command, kubectl drain, to remove the node from a service. Something like this, drain that node name. Now I am going to get some kind of a warning or error. Now I'm going to get some kind of a warning or error. Let me show that. kubectl drain, drain that node. What it is saying? Unable to drain the node, due to error. Cannot delete daemon set managed pods. Do we have some daemon set related pods running? Proxy pod, vnet pod, and some other daemon set pods running in that node? Not only just your application pod, you have some other daemon set pods like a proxy, vnet, and other daemon set pods. So it is saying unable to delete those daemon set pods. And is it asking me to use this option -- ignore daemon sets option? Along with this one, it is saying, so forget about this one, because those are daemon set pods. That pods will not get scheduled to any new node. But except daemon set pods, any other workloads like a normal deployment related, stateful related pods, those pods will remove from this node. And if you have any other nodes available in the cluster with enough CPU, enough memory available, if all the conditions are satisfied, does those pods get scheduled to that other nodes after removing from this node? Yes. Now let me execute this one. So I am draining the node. My node is unschedulable. I have drained the node. Now it is evicted. That part which is running in that node. But why it is in pending state? It has removed. When I execute this drain command, it removed that existing part from that node. But why again it is in pending state? Because I don't have enough nodes. I don't have enough CPU, enough memory. But if you want to go for a maintenance, do I need to have enough nodes, enough servers with enough CPU and memory available so that I can upgrade the patches or do the patches by draining some nodes? Yes. Once your upgrade or maintenance window is done, once your upgrade and once your maintenance window is done, you can go to that server, you can SSH to that server, and you can do whatever patch you want to do. Once that is done, can I make that node again available for scheduling? Can I make that node again available for scheduling the pods once the patch, once the maintenance is done, if required? Yes. So what command I can use again to make that available? I will use this uncardon, uncardon, uncardon. Now, this is in pending state because I don't have enough nodes. I don't have enough nodes, enough CPU available in that nodes. Now, I am again uncardoning that node. Uncardon, uncardon. Now, is that node becomes again available for scheduler to schedule? U small, uncardon. Again, I uncardon that node. Now, do you see whatever part which was in pending state here, is it again scheduled to that node? Is everyone clear what is this cardon, drain, uncardon? What do you mean by maintenance, node maintenance or cluster maintenance? They may ask differently. They may not ask directly what is cardon, what is uncardon, what is drain. They may ask in a scenario based. I want my Kubernetes cluster. I have some nodes. I want to do some kind of a maintenance activity without impacting the applications. How do you do all those things? Is everyone clear about whatever concepts we discussed? What do you mean by node selector, node affinity, pod affinity, taints? So these type of scenario based questions also you will get in the CKA, Certified Kubernetes Administrator exam also. They may ask you to cardon the node, drain the node, uncardon the node. So this is all about scheduling. Compare with the Docker Swarm. If you observe, does Kubernetes has a lot of features? Lot of features compared to the Docker Swarm in Kubernetes. Do we have a lot of features? And also, do we have a lot of learning curve also? Learning curve in the sense you need to understand lot of concepts. There are huge concepts to understand in Kubernetes. Kubernetes has a lot of learning curve. You need to know a lot of concepts in Kubernetes to get familiar with Kubernetes. Now next go to altogether a different concept, resource quota. Resource quota and another concept called a limit range. So as I already told multiple times, if multiple teams are using the Kubernetes cluster, your Kubernetes cluster is shared with multiple teams within your project, within your application. So how do you isolate one application or one application team's applications or Kubernetes resources from other application team or other project Kubernetes resources? Here in Kubernetes, what concept we will use? Using a namespace. We can use a namespace. We can use a namespace to isolate one application related Kubernetes or one team related Kubernetes objects or resources with other application teams or other project Kubernetes resources by creating a namespaces. By creating a namespaces. But if multiple teams are using same Kubernetes cluster, do I need to properly manage the resources available in my cluster? Do I need to properly manage the resources available in the cluster like CPU, memory, volumes? Now, let's say application A or team A is creating hundreds of pods, hundreds of deployments. Does other team, other application will have enough resources to manage or deploy their applications if other team is overutilizing the resources? No. Is there any way I can control the resources at a namespace level? Is there any way I can control resources at a namespace level? Resource in the sense, it can be number of parts which you want to create, it can be number of volumes which you want to create, it can be number of CPU limits and request, or memory limits and request. Is it possible to set at the namespace level? Yes. That is what a concept of resource quota. Resource quota. Using resource quota. What do you mean by resource quota? Resource quota in Kubernetes. Resource quota is a API again. Resource quota is an API, again Kubernetes object. Does that resource quota provides constraints that can limit resource consumptions per namespace level? Using that resource quota, can I limit the aggregate resource consumption per a namespace level? At a namespace level, can I restrict how many pods can be created, how much CPU memory can be used in that namespace? Yes. So when several users are team sharing the Kubernetes cluster with the fixed number of nodes, when several users or teams sharing a Kubernetes cluster with fixed number of nodes or servers with some capacity, there is a concern that one team could use more than its a fair share of resources. Just to make things simple, right? You went to you went to a restaurant with your friends, you went to a restaurant with your friends. You ordered a family pack of biryani, and only one guy is taking complete family pack. Maybe one guy is taking 70% of that family pack. Other guys will strive. They will strive for resources, like they will strive for biryani. Similarly here, one team is overutilizing the resources. Other team will not have enough CPU, enough memory to manage or deploy their applications. So as as an administrator, I need to control these things. That I can control using resource quota concept here. A resource quota defined by this object, resource quota object, that can limit aggregate resource consumption. What do you mean by aggregate resource consumption? Aggregate in the sense, sum of all the pods, sum of all the Kubernetes objects or pods which you are creating in that namespace. I can set the quota at a namespace level. So on what basis I can set? Is it possible for me to set resource, request CPUs, limit CPU? I mean to say, is it possible for me to set how much CPU that namespace, that pods in that namespace can request? Total. How much CPU that pods in that namespace can limit? I can set a, based on this limit CPU, limit memory, request CPU, request memory. So across all the pods in that namespace, the sum of CPU limit should not exceed this value. I can set a CPU, memory, and also is it possible for me to set number of persistent values? How many values can be created? How many claims can be created in that one also? Yes. Not only that one, can I set a limit? I mean to say count of services can be created, count of like a deployments, how many deployments can be created, how many pods can be created. Can I use this one also? Like your ration quota, number of, like, how many kgs of ration you will eligible, I know how many liters of oil you are eligible, kind of a quota. So I can set that limit. Then does that application teams, will they able to create more than whatever we have allocated in the resource quota in that namespace? Will they able to deploy more than that? No. Now, to make things simple, let me create a resource quota like this. As of now, do I have any resource quota? As of now, do I have any resource quota on any namespace? No. Now I can create a resource quota. You can see the samples, examples here also. I can create a resource quota like this. Now, if you see, as of now, kubectl API resources. kubectl API resources. Do I have one API resource called resource quota here? Do I have one Kubernetes object called resource quota here? It is namespaced scope. Now this is the full form, this is the short form. Now when I say kubectl get quota or resource quota. In the short form it is quota, in the full form it is resource quota. As of now, do I have any resource quota in the default namespace? Did I created any resource quota for this default namespace? No. Now for test namespace also, do I have any resource quota created? Or for the sake, in any namespace, do I have any resource quota? No. Now, since I don't have any resource quotas, can I deploy n number of deployments, n number of pods in these namespaces? Yes. Now let me create a resource quota now. Something like this. API version v1, kind resource quota, something like this. Now, without mentioning the namespace, if I create a resource quota like this resource quota gets created for which namespace? Whatever namespace it is pointing by your kubectl context. To which context? To which namespace currently my kubectl is pointing? The default. Because I changed again. It is pointing to default only. It is pointing to default only. It is not pointing to the test namespace. If you see, it is pointing to default only. Now, is this quota gets created for default namespace now? Now, if I want this to be set, can I mention namespace like this? Yes. Now here in this spec, I am setting a hard limit. It can request this much CPU, this much memory, this much limits, this much memory limits, which means now I am creating one deployment. Just to give an example, I am creating one deployment. Let's say I am creating one deployment. That can be any deployment, any application. I am creating one deployment in that namespace. Let's consider in that namespace. Let's consider. Now I am creating something like this, 2 replicas. Now CPU request 1, memory request 1 GB. Now here I am requesting 500 millicore and 256 MI of memory. So 500 millicore I am requesting. Now the limit, I mean to say request CPU, I have given 1 GB. Now 500 plus 500, 1 CPU. But now if I try to create three pods in that namespace, and this is the quota of that namespace, do you think you will get a third pod? Do you think you will get a third pod? Because I am requesting 500 millicore with three replicas. So how much we are requesting in total? 500 plus 500 plus 500. I am requesting this much. Resource request CPU 1500. But what is the limit I have set for that request CPU? At a namespace level, what is the request I have set at a 1? So do you think you will get a third pod in that namespace? Even though your cluster have lot of servers, even though your cluster have lot of CPU, lot of memory available, do you think? No. Now, what do you mean by this request memory? What do you mean by this request memory? You are requesting like this. Now, some of all the pods, all the deployments, it should not go beyond this much. It should not go beyond this much. Let's say you are requesting like this 256 mi, and I am creating like 2 replicas, 3 replicas for this application. Then it should not exceed this one. This limits is basically whatever limits you are using. It is not only for single pod. Any deployment, any replica set, any stateful set gets deployed in that namespace. Sum of all these resource requests and limits of all the deployments, all the pods in that namespace, can it go beyond this much requests and limits? No. So it cannot go beyond that much. Now, this is at a resources level. Is it possible to set the count of like number of pods can be created, number of deployments can be created in that namespace, number of services or secrets can be created in that namespace? Yes. So you can use something like this count. There is a field called count, something like this. Here you already saw it. Maybe if you see count, something like this, count of pods, count of deployments, count of services, like this. You have these fields here. You have, they have given here, right? The count, something like this. Count of persistent volume claims, count of services, count of secrets, count of pods, count of deployments, like this. How many deployments, something like this. Count of deployment dot apps, how much you can create. Count of pods, how many you can create. You need to use this one, something like this. Let's say I have given something like this. Now, even though I have enough, I have given like 10 CPU, I have given like 10 GI, limits 20 CPU, 20 GI. Now, if I give deployment as one, will I able to create more than one deployment? No. So this is how it works. Guys, this is just a quota. When I am creating a quota, does this Kubernetes will check whether I have this much CPUs, this much memory available in the cluster? Is it going to check? No, it is not going to check. It will just set that limit. That's it. But do you need to make sure when you are creating a quotas, do you need to make sure whether I have enough nodes, enough CPU, enough memory available? Otherwise, again, does your parts goes to pending state even though you have a quota? Does your part goes to pending states if you don't have enough servers available with enough CPU and memory available? Yes. This is just a limit. This is not going to check whether your cluster have this much CPU, this much memory available. It is not going to check. This is just a quota. You need to make sure you have that servers, that much CPU, that much memory. Now, let me do something like this. Let me do something like this. I am creating a quota now. Resource quota. While creating a namespace itself, along with namespace YML, can I create this quota also in the same? While creating a namespace itself, can I do this? Yes. So while creating a namespace itself, you can do this. But how do you know how much CPU, how much memory you can set the limits? How do you know how much request, how much limits are you going to set? Do you need to work with that respective team, the development team, that application team who is going to deploy their applications in this namespace? Do you need to understand how many pods, how many deployments they want to deploy? Each pod is requesting how much CPU, how much memory for that, all the microservices, all the applications which the team is deploying in this namespace. Do you need to work with the developers or architect of the team to understand what is their requirement, how much CPUs they are expecting, how much memory they are expecting, how many deployments and pods they are planning to deploy? Based on that, will you set the quota? Yes. Now I am just demonstrating like this with this. Now I am going to set the pod limit also like this. I am going to set the pod count also like this. So number of pods, like pods 3. Let's say, is it possible for me to limit like this, like count count slash deployment dash dot apps like this. So if I set like this 2, is it going to allow to create a more than 2 deployments? No. I can set the number of pods also, pods like this 2, 1, like this. Based on the requirement, you can set all these things. Now let me set pod count as maybe 1. Let me set pod count as 1. For now, demonstrating, I'm just setting the pod count as 1. Now let me apply this. Let me apply this. Pod count also I'm giving like this 1. This is for which namespace I am applying. In my manifest file, I already have the namespace name. Now the quota, does the quota, resource quota, is it set for this namespace test ns? Now can I see? Now request CPU, request memory, limit CPU, because I already have some parts. I already have some parts. Is it showing like you are setting the count of parts as 1, but already there are 2 parts? Because do I already have some parts running? Do I already have some parts running? You set it as a 1, but it is already 2. But this is already deployed. Is this quota is enforcing that parts to be deleted, existing parts, because already some parts are there, and you created a quota just now. But in the typical situation, are you going to create a quota while creating a namespace itself before you deploy any applications, any deployments into that namespace? Yes. Now let me delete this for now. Let me delete this for now. Whatever applications, parts, whatever I have in that namespace, I am deleting everything now. I am deleting everything now. Now let me see the quota. Now this much limit memory I have set, because none of the parts are running. Is it showing 0? Because none of the parts are running, none of the parts got scheduled in that namespace. You have this much limit for memory. So as of now, no one is using, everything is 0, 0, 0 like this. Now I want to deploy this application. That can be any application. That can be any application. One, if you observe here, now I am requesting this much CPU. Resource request 500 millicore, memory 256. As per my quota request, do I have one CPU? Which means one CPU is the limit you can request CPU that much memory. Now, but the number of pods, what is the limit number of pods I have given here for that resource quota? 1. Now how many replicas I'm trying to create for this deployment? 2. Now does this resource quota comes into picture? Does this resource quota will allow you to get schedule that second pod now in that namespace? Let me apply. Let me apply. Let me apply this application. Now that is in that namespace only, test namespace. That is in that namespace only, test namespace. Now if you see, one pod is running. Why it is not ready? Because of that liveness probe, readiness probe. But if you see the deployment 0 by 2, 0 by 2, how many replicas I'm expecting for that? How many replicas I'm expecting for that? As of now, how many are ready? How many are ready? 0. Why? Even though the pod is running, why it is not showing as ready? At least one pod I can see why that is not ready, because of the health check. This pod is performing the liveness probe, readiness probe. Once this becomes ready, can I see at least 1 by 2 here? Once this becomes ready, at least can I see 1 by 2 here? So you are expecting 2, currently only 1. You can see desired 2, currently 1. Why? What happened to the other one? Why it is not coming? Why? What happened to the other one? Why it is not coming? Why it is not scheduled? Even though I am expecting 2 pods, the pod itself I don't see here. Now how to know what could be the reason? What could be the reason? Now you describe your deployment or maybe replica set. Let me describe my deployment and see. Now it is showing 1 by 2, up to date one, available one, but other one is not there. Let me describe my deployment, this deployment name, and let's see. Now I don't see much information in the deployment, because deployment will internally create what? Deployment is internally create what to manage your pods? Replica set. Now can I describe this replica set and see what is the reason? Describe rs, that replica set name, the namespace name. Now what do you see here? It said created one pod, error creating this pod, error creating this pod. What is this? Forbidden. Forbidden. What do you mean by forbidden quota here? Forbidden quota, which means you are trying to overutilize than your fair set of resources. Now if you see, now you see the quota now, kubectl get quota. Now what is the number of pods which I can schedule? You can see the quota number of pods which I can schedule in this namespace one. Currently one pod is running. Now even though you have some this much one CPU you set as a request CPU, only one pod is running, that pod is using this much, still you have a memory request, CPU request, you have a memory limit, CPU limits. Is this pod limit is allow you to schedule that other pod? No, that is not possible. That's why it is not working. Now at any point of time, later point of time, if you need more resources to be available in this namespace, from application team side, as a development team side, or from application team side, can you create a ticket, or can you work with you can create a Jira ticket if they are using Jira, or you can send a mail to the administrator of that Kubernetes who is managing that Kubernetes cluster, like the DevOps engineer who is owning and managing that Kubernetes cluster. You can create a ticket or you can send a mail to increase the quota. Is it possible to increase the quota? If you have you really need to deploy that application and you don't have enough quota, will you able to request the administrator of the Kubernetes to increase the quota? Yes. Now let me change the quota. Now if I really need, I can change the quota. Now instead of one pod, let's say they are requesting really 2 pods. I'm setting a pod limits as 2. Let me reapply. I mean to say, let me apply that again. Let me apply that again. Now you see the quota. Now I have 2/1. Even though I increase the quota, now if you see, is that pod is getting scheduled? Is that pod is getting scheduled? No, because this requires a redeployment. This requires a redeployment. You modify the quota, it requires a redeployment, which means you need to delete that existing one. You delete this existing deployment, delete deployment, the deployment name. You need to redeploy the deployment again. You deleted the deployment. Now you redeploy the deployment. This is applied. Now let me apply that YML again. Now you see the number of pods. Now can I see number of pods? 2. Now you see the quota. You see the quota. You see the quota now. 2/2. Now, even though I have pod limit as 3, even though I have a pod limit as 3, will I able to deploy any other pod, any other application? Because you already overutilized, you are already used this request CPU this much. Even though you have this limit CPU, limit memory, request memory is still there, but already this is reached. Now, even though I have a number of pods as 3, in my resource quota, let's say I have number of pods as 3 or 4, that doesn't matter here. Let me apply kubectl apply -f. Now let me try to deploy any pod, that doesn't matter, any application, any pod. Let's say if I have any other pod, let's say this pod, Nginx pod, this pod, whether I am directly creating a pod deployment, that doesn't matter. When I apply in that namespace only, guys, in that namespace only, kubectl apply -f, that pod -n test -ns. When I'm going to apply this, do you think this pod gets scheduled? Now, one more important point to remember here. One more important point to remember here. If I have a resource quotas defined in a namespace, do I need to define that resources in my pods, my containers? Without defining the resources in my pods, my containers, does again Kubernetes will allow these pods to be deployed? I have a resource quota defined in that namespace, but I am trying to deploy a pod without using those resources, without using the resource limits and request here. Do you think does this pod will be allowed? Does Kubernetes will allow this request? Because here I am not requesting any CPU, any memory. Let me show that. Now, do you see? While scheduling itself, it has thrown error. While applying that pod itself, it has thrown error saying that you need to request, you need to define these things. You must specify what it is saying. You must specify resource request limit CPUs here. Did I specify that one in this pod, in this container? No. But if I deploy same thing in the default namespace, is it going to allow? Because I don't have a resource quota set for the default namespace. Is it going to allow? Yes. So when you have a resource quotas defined, is it mandatory to define resource request and limits in your pod, your containers? Yes. But is there any other way I can apply some kind of a default resource and limit, default resource request and limits, even though application teams are not specifying that one in the manifest? Is it possible to apply some default limits and requests? Yes. That is where this comes, limit range, limit range, limit range. So what do you mean by limit range? By default, containers will run with unbound computing resources. So with resource quotas, a cluster administrator can restrict the resource consumption within a namespace. Now, when there is a resource quota, you need to mandatorily define that resources, how much you need. Now, a limit range, using a limit range, what we can do, limit range is a policy to constrain resource allocations to the pods or containers in a namespace. Using limit range, I can enforce minimum maximum resources used per pod or container in a namespace, and enforce the minimum maximum storage also like this. And I can set a default request limit also. Using this limit range, what I can do, default resource request and limits also, which means if someone is missing to define that resource request and limits, by creating a limit range, can I apply some default resource request and limits? What by default it will use that one? Yes. And also, can I limit what is the maximum minimum CPU memory can be requested by your pod also? Yes. Using this limit range, I can do that. Now I can create a limit range like this. I can create a limit range like this. So here you have the details. Now can I create a limit range like this? The way I have a resource quota, I can define limit range like this. Limits, max, min, something like this. Suppose I am saying max 400 m, min 200 m, like this. Memory also, memory, let's say minimum, I am saying something like this 256 mi, maximum, something like this. Maybe you can use 500 MB max. This one also you can use whatever it is. Let's say 512 MI like this. Now, this is the default. This is the default values. At the same time, does any part can request more than this one? This is the default. At the same time, suppose some part is using like this. Some part is using like this. Do you think it will allow? Some part is using like this. Do you think it will allow? This is the default values as well as maximum each that container level how much it can request. If someone is defining like this, do you think it will allow because of this limit range? I am limiting only at a container level, maximum any container can request only this much. So is it going to allow if I define like this? That is the default value and also maximum also what it can request. Hope you are clear. What is this limit range? It's a default values if someone is not defining. At the same time, even though someone is defining the resource request and limits at a container level, does then anyone can request more than this much CPU, those more than this much memory request and limits? No. Now, this is the default one. This is the default one which I can allow. Right? Now let me define that limit range. Now I am creating a limit range. I am creating a limit range. But in real time, you will not have a limit range like this. Maybe one CPU, memory 2 GB or 4 GB like that you will use. Now this is my limit range. Now do I need to mention namespace? In which namespace I want to set this limit range? Yes. So let me apply that. Let me apply that limit range. 1 second. Limit range max must be a standard resource type or fully qualified. Let's see. Sorry, this is not max. This is memory. This is memory. Now, if you see, do I have a limit range also now? kubectl get limit range. This is also one Kubernetes API. Now, do I have a limit range created? If you want to see kubectl get limit range, that limit range name -o yaml -n, that namespace. Now, this is the limit ranges I have defined. Now, if someone is missing to define that limits like this, now it is going to use that limit range values. But now why I am getting this error now? 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 If you see quota, you see the quota. Why I am getting basically this error? Because is the CPUs are already overutilized? Because of that, I am not able to schedule. If required, Let me increase that one also. Let me increase that one. Maybe I am saying maybe like 1.5, 1.5 core or 2 core like this. 1.5. Now let me apply that resource quota again. Let me apply that resource quota. Sorry, resource quota. First, let me apply that resource quota. Then, one second. This lot of things came here, or maybe 2 core like that. Let me apply the resource quota. Now you see the quota. You see the quota. Now it is 1500 millicore. Now let me apply this Nginx pod. Let me apply this Nginx pod in that namespace, because in the manifest I have not mentioned the namespace. At runtime I am using, but in that manifest did I define resources, requests and limits for that pod, that container? No. But is it going to use these limit ranges, whatever I have defined, that limit range values? By default, yes. Now you see, do I have that pod scheduled now? Do I have that pod scheduled now? That Nginx pod? But it is in pending for some reason. It is in pending for some reason. Now limit range, it has succeeded. Sorry, that resource quota, it is succeeded, but why it is in pending state? Resource quota is fine. There is no problem with resource quota. Now what is the actual problem? Do I really have a servers? Do I really have a servers with that much CPU memory available? Do I have any servers, any systems available? No. So resource quota is just a condition. Resource quota is just a condition before your pods are getting scheduled. Is it going to validate? Is Kubernetes is going to validate against the resource quota created in that namespace before that scheduler will try to assign a node? Before that scheduler will try to assign a node, is your Kubernetes will check the resource quota first? Yes. Is everyone clear, guys? What is resource quota? What is limit range? How it works? So these are kind of administration. These are kind of administration tasks. These are kind of administration tasks, kind of administration, Kubernetes administration. Now, let's, if you don't want all these things, can I delete the quota? Can I delete that resource quota and limit range? But in actual Kubernetes clusters, when multiple teams are using, are you going to use this resource quotas and limit ranges concept? Yes. So if I explain this in the beginning itself, you don't know what is happening in your cluster, how to troubleshoot, all those things. That's why I have explained at the last. But while creating a namespace itself, are you going to define resource quotas and limit ranges as per the requirement of that application? Later, at any point of time, based on the requirement from that application team, will you be able to increase or decrease the quota, resource quota? Yes. So that is how it works. Now, let's understand one more important concept called network policies. Network policies in Kubernetes. Network policies in Kubernetes. Guys, by default, does one pod in a Kubernetes cluster can communicate with another pod? By default, does one Kubernetes within the cluster, does one Kubernetes pod can communicate with other Kubernetes pod by default? Yes. By default, one Kubernetes pod can communicate with other Kubernetes pod without any restriction. Without any restriction. Now let's say I have a use case. I am running some pods, some applications, some pods in my Kubernetes cluster, but I want allow the request to that pod only from set of pods. Only from set of pods. Is that possible in Kubernetes? Yes, that is possible using a concept called network policies. How can I say in simple words? Let's consider a servers. Let's consider a server, your virtual machines. Will I able to block the traffic to that server using firewalls? Using firewalls, will I able to block the traffic to the servers? Let's say you are using servers. Will I able to block the traffic using firewalls in the servers? Yes. Similarly, in my Kubernetes, I am running my pods. In my Kubernetes cluster, I am running my pods. I am running my applications as a containers in the pods. Within the cluster also, will I able to block the traffic to specific pod from so and so pod? Is it possible to allow the traffic to that pod only from so and so pods in the cluster? Yes, that is possible using network policies. Just give me a minute, guys. I'll be back in a minute. We'll continue. 1 minute. Okay, guys, we'll continue. So what I was discussing here, let's say this is my Kubernetes cluster. Let's say this is my Kubernetes cluster. I have some pods. Let's say this is one pod, pod A, and this is pod B. Or let's consider this way. This is application one pod, app one pod. This is, let's consider app two pod. Now that pod might be running here, here, here. That doesn't matter for now. Now by default, is these pods can communicate with each other using services concept. Using services concept, you can use, right? So you can use the service name. There is a concept called service here. In Kubernetes, you have a concept of service. You use that service. You use that service name. That service will route the traffic to this pod. But by default, is it allow? Is it going to block by default? By default, any pod in that cluster can communicate with another pod in the cluster. There is nothing is getting blocked here. It will allow. But I have a requirement. I have a requirement within that cluster. I want this pod to be reached from only this pod. Let's say I have another pod, another application pod. Let's say I have app C. App C. This pod should not communicate with this one, even though it is using that service name. Even though this also using this service name, I don't want this pod to be reached. Whether it's a database pod, whether it's an application pod, this application should not able to communicate with this one. If it is a database, it should not able to talk to the database. If it is another application, it should not able to make a API call to this application pod. If you have these type of requirements within Kubernetes also, is it possible to restrict or allow the communication between pods? Yes, that is possible using a concept called network policies. That is possible using a concept called network policies in Kubernetes. Network policies are implemented by the Kubernetes plugin. So if you want to control the traffic flow at IP address or a port level, if you want to control the traffic flow at a IP address or port level, like your pod IP and a container port level, then you can consider a Kubernetes network policies for a particular applications in your cluster. You can use these network policies. Network policy allow you to specify how pod is allowed to communicate with other various network entities. Using network policies, we can define, you can allow you to specify how pod can communicate with other various network entities. Network entities in the sense your endpoints are services. Your endpoints or services are called as network entities. Now network policies we can apply with a pod on one side or both sides. What do you mean by one side or both sides? Basically, there are two things here: ingress, egress. You can define these network policies at a ingress traffic or egress traffic. What do you mean by ingress traffic? What do you mean by egress traffic? Same, consider as a security group in the AWS. Consider as a security group in the AWS. In security group, do you have a two things? Do you have a two things? One is inbound and outbound. What do you mean by inbound? What do you mean by outbound? In AWS security group, that is a firewall at a system level. That AWS security group is a firewall at a system level. So what do you mean by inbound? What do you mean by outbound? Inbound means incoming traffic. Inbound means incoming traffic. The traffic coming to that server. Now here, using network policies, can I define ingress traffic? Ingress in the sense the traffic coming to that pod, any pod, incoming request. And is it possible to control outgoing traffic also? Can I block outgoing traffic also? Can I close the exit gate also using egress traffic, egress policies? Yes. So using these network policies, I can define, using these network policies, I can define how a pod can communicate with other things. Other pods that are not allowed, the namespaces level we can allow, we can control at IP level or namespace level, at a pod level also I can allow or block the traffic using these network policies. But if I want to use network policies, do I need to use some plugin, some network plugin, which is implemented by that network policy? Does these network policies has to be already implemented or supported by that network plugin, which I am already using as a prerequisite? Yes. So network policies are implemented by network plugin. To use network policies, you must use a networking solution which is supporting network policy. What do you mean by networking plugin? Did we use some kind of a networking plugin already in our Kubernetes cluster? What networking plugin, what CNI I used as of now in my Kubernetes cluster? VNet. Like VNet, do you have other networking solutions like Calico, Flannel, Ramona, like that? Now, if you have to use these network policies, do you need to use that networking plugin which is going to support these network policies? Yes. So these are the networking plugins. Like there are a lot of networking plugins, CNI, container networking interface. There are a lot of implementations for that. And you need to use a CNI supported network policies. Like a Calico supports network policies, Flannel also supports network policies, VNet also supports. Now I am using VNet. VNet is already supporting that network policies. So can I create a network policies in this Kubernetes cluster? Yes. Now I can create something like this network policy. Is this again one Kubernetes API? Is this again one Kubernetes API? One Kubernetes object? Like this, I can create a network policy. The way you are creating a pod, the way you are creating a persistent volume, deployment services, if required, can I create a network policy also like this? Yes. There is a Kubernetes API called network policy. Let me show that. kubectl API resources. Now, can I see something called network policy here? If you want to grep also, you can grep here. Network policy. Kind network policy namespace true. API version is this. Full form network policies. Short form netpol. Do I have any net policies? I mean to say network policies in any namespace as of now. I don't have any network policies. It a namespace scope. With a namespace scope, I can create a network policy. Now, API version is this one, kind network policy. This is the name of the network policy. In which namespace you want to create. Now here, there are two things. There are two important things here. One is pod selector. One is pod selector. So this network policy is for which pod? This network policy is for which pod? This works at a pod level, namespace level, and all those things. Now, this network policy, you are creating a network policy, like a kind of a firewall you are creating, but this is for which pod? How it will identify for which pod this is going to apply? This network policies will be created for which pod? Are we going to use something called pod selector here? Here in my network policy, I'm using a pod selector. Let's consider this use case. Let's consider this use case. Let's say this is my Mongo database pod. Just to give an example, this is my Mongo database pod. Now I have a labels. I have a labels on this pod. I have a labels on this pod. When it is a pod, whether it's a stateful set, I have add a labels on this pod. Let's say this is my pod labels. Now I want to create a network policies for this pod or set of pods. Let's say I have a stateful set. Let's say I have a stateful set for my database pod. I have a set of pods. Now, does each pod has this label as per the manifest? You created a stateful set for your database, or you have any deployment like we have these pods. Now, I want only this application to reach this pod, this pod, this pod. Do I need to create a network policies for this pods or this application? Do I need to create a network policy for this pod? It is a set of pods or single pod. Now, can I use this pod labels here as a pod selector match labels like this? Which means whatever network policies I am creating, here, is these policies will be applied on this pod? Yes. So that is what pod selector. This is applied on which pod? That is pod selector. Here you have two things, policy types, ingress and egress. What do you mean by ingress? What do you mean by egress? What do you mean by ingress? What do you mean by egress? Ingress in the sense incoming traffic. Incoming traffic. The traffic, the request or traffic which is coming to these pods are called as ingress traffic. The traffic which is coming to these pods are called as ingress traffic. The traffic which is going outside from this pod, can the traffic which is going outside from this pod, can I consider as egress traffic or outbound traffic? Yes. Now you can define either only ingress or only egress or both. But most of the cases we are only bothered about what? Incoming. I want to block incoming traffic only. Outgoing, outgoing can be taken care at other level also. Outgoing can be taken care by other level. Now, this one, just to give an example, can I block the request at outgoing of this one itself? Can I block the request of outgoing traffic from this pod here itself? Yes. Even though I am not doing here, can I block in the incoming traffic of this pod? Can I block the incoming traffic of this pod also? To specific to this pod, yes. So most of the cases, we are worried about ingress. If required, you can block at outgoing also. Now this is ingress, egress both. Now ingress, from where you are allowing, from where you are allowing. Request coming to this pods, request coming to this pods, from where you are allowing, like a source. Now if you see, there are three ways I can define the source. One is what? One is the range of IPs. One is the range of IPs. The source IP is in this range. Then only it will allow incoming traffic to this pod. One is range of the IPs. What is the other thing? Instead of range of IPs, what is the other thing? From, can I allow specific from from specific namespace based on the labels on the namespace? Based on the labels on the namespace, can I allow also? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? Let's say this pod I created in a test NS. This pod I created in a test NS. This pod I created in a test NS. Now here, can I say something like this? Whatever label I have added on the test namespace, let's consider kubectl describe ns, that test ns. I have created one namespace. The test namespace, I have added a label like this, team, testing team. Now if I say something like this, now any pods which are there in this namespace, is it allowed to communicate with these pods? Any pods which are there in this namespace, the namespace which has a label, if the pods are in that namespace, does that pods will be allowed to communicate with these pods? Yes. This is at a namespace level. But again, on which port it will allow? Whether it is from this range of IP, whether this is from this namespace, to which port it is allowed? Am I defining that on which port it can communicate? Here, can I say on which port? This is just a sample, guys. This is just a sample. Now, this is, let's consider this is your Mongo database. Can I say 27017, that container port, that pod has that container port? Can I say something like this? Yes. This is on which port you want to communicate on this port, from where you are allowed to communicate. Will I able to define range of IPs like this, or will I able to use the labels of the namespace so that any pod in that namespace can communicate with that this pod on this port in the ingress traffic? Let's say I don't want to use this namespace level. I want to allow only some pod. Instead of namespace selector, can I use pod selector also? I don't want any pod in that namespace to communicate. I want to only communicate with some specific pods. Instead of namespace selector, can I use pod selector here? Yes, something like this. Let's say I have this application C also in the same namespace. I have application C also in the same namespace. Now if I create a rule like this, I don't want to use this IP. Let's say I have created a rule like this, namespace selector. Now that is also in the same namespace. Now is this one and this one also allowed to communicate with these pods as per the network policies defined on that database pod? If I do like this namespace selector, yes. But let's consider this is in a different namespace. This is in a different namespace. Let's consider default namespace. Now, is it going to allow? Does this part will be allowed to communicate with this one? If this is my network policy on the database pod, and this is how I have given, is it going to allow? If the default namespace doesn't have a label like this, if default namespace doesn't have a label like this, is it going to allow? No. This is at a namespace level. But I don't want like this. I want only this part to communicate with this part. Instead of namespace selector, can I use something like this pod selector, like this app, whatever label you have on that one. Let's say you have this pod. This pod has a label like this. This pod has a label like this. App spring app like this. Which means if request is coming from this pod to this pod on port 27017, then only it will allow. Now let's consider this pod has a different label. Then is it going to allow like this if you define pod selector in the ingress incoming traffic like this? No. So this is incoming, but outgoing. What do you mean by outgoing? Suppose outgoing in the sense this pod should not communicate with any other pod. Now it's, I can restrict. Now let's say I don't want this to communicate with internet. I don't want this to communicate with internet. Let's say this database pod should not communicate with internet or any other IP. I don't want this to download softwares from internet. Is it possible to block that request also, even though I'm executing yum install or apt install in this pod container? If I block outgoing traffic here, will it able to go outside of this container? The request will be allowed to go outside of that container? No. So I can block that using egress traffic. I can block that using egress traffic. But most of the cases you will not do that egress traffic. Okay. Is everyone clear? Is everyone clear? What do you mean by this pod selector here? Which means this network policy is applicable for the pod where that pod has this label. And what do you mean by this ingress and egress here? If it is ingress incoming, and again from which source you are allowing for that on this port, this is outgoing. Is everyone clear? The manifest of network policy, what is this? Now, there is a default deny, there is a default allow. There is a default deny, there is a default allow also. Guys, this is what I have explained. What is mandatory fields? What do you mean by spec? What do you mean by pod selector? What is ingress? What is egress? I have discussed all these things here. Now, default deny. Let's say if I create a policy like this, I am using pod selector as empty, policy type as ingress, but I am not defining anything like this. So here I am creating a policy like this. I am creating a policy like this. Pod selector is empty, policy type is ingress. Here I have not used any selector, it is empty. I just defined ingress, but I have not defined from where it is allowed. So which means, is it going to block all the traffic for all the pods, whatever is there in that namespace? Because this is at a namespace level. Now if I create this one in this namespace, now the pods in that namespace will be able to communicate with each other, because this is a default deny. I am just applying empty. Empty in the sense it is going to apply for all the pods which are in that namespace. And I have defined policy type ingress, but I have not given from where to route, on which port to allow. So since I have not defined this one here, is it kind of a default deny, like you are blocking all the traffic to any pod from any pod in that namespace on any port? Yes. This is default deny. Now let me demonstrate one application. But I'll remove all those quotas and all these things once your practice is done, because I may need to deploy a lot of applications. I'm going to remove that resource quotas, limit ranges, all those things. Now let me deploy same application. I'm deploying this application, maybe stateful set or replica set, that doesn't matter. Let me take this application, let me take this application, Spring App PVC application. So I am creating a pod. I am creating a pod. I am creating a pod. Spring application one replica. Database also one replica for now. I am using as a replica set. That doesn't matter for now. Now there is no network policies. Now when I am applying this, is it going to communicate with each other? Does that Spring application pods will be communicate with the database pods now, because there is no network policies created as of now in that namespace? Is those pods can communicate with each other by default? Now let me delete if I have any other applications so that you can easily understand. kubectl delete. I'm going to delete this deployment so that you can easily understand. I'm deleting this deployment. Deployment. Let me delete the deployment so that you can easily understand. Now maybe that Nginx pod, leave it. Let me delete that Nginx pod also, whatever I deployed directly that pod. Now I have a database pod and I have an application pod. There are services created. There are services created. Now by default, there is no network policies. Is this Spring application pod will be able to communicate with this database pod using service name, like this service name, Mongo SVC. Now you can access the application and verify also. You can access the application and verify because that application internally using that service name. You can access this application 31557. You can use that port in one of the server. In one of the server, you can use that port and access. Just 2 minutes, guys. I'll finish this. Just 2 minutes. I'll wrap up this quickly. Now, let me go to one of the server, maybe where I'll open that port. This is UI application. In this security group, I'll open that port if that is not already opened. This is AWS concept. This is AWS concept, nothing to do with your Kubernetes or network policies here. This is AWS concept. Now I am opening, which server is this? Where I came? Kubernetes master security group. Okay, let me open this. Edit in boundaries. Let me open whatever that port. Now let me use that machine IP address to access that application. That application machine IP address, that node IP and node port. This is front-end application. Is this front-end application is allowed to communicate with that database pod by default because there are no network policies. There is no network policies. 1 second. This IP I have used in this security group. In security group, what is that port? 31557. 31557. Second is 31557. Why it is not allowed? 1 second. 31557. 1 second. Let me double check. kubectl get ep -n test-ns. Which one I am using? I think I am using correct one. 31557 is pointing to this pod. Curl-v. Let me directly use this pod. kubectl. This pod is running. Let me go inside this pod. Let me go inside this pod. So, 1 second, guys. Maybe I have some issue with my system, that server. Let me show you. Something wrong with that node. Something wrong with that node. Maybe something went wrong with that node. kubectl get nodes. Nodes are ready. There are no issues with nodes. 10250 timeout. There is no issue with my kube system parts also. But let's see why. Maybe I have removed some ports, maybe in the security groups. Let's check in the security group. All traffic, all ports is open here, 172.31.0.0. In the workers, if you see in the workers, in the worker, somehow I removed in the worker, the security group, the ports got removed. So here, you see in this, right, that required ports are not opened. Somehow, just now I think it got deleted. Because of that, I am not able to reach. So let me open. I'll open for now that all traffic, not for everywhere. I'll open only for that 172.31.0.0/16. All traffic, all protocol. I'll open. Now the control plane, the master is not able to communicate with worker because of that ports. Because of that ports, it is not able to communicate. That's why it is not allowed. Now I can access this application. Now, is this application internally communicating with the database? By default, do you have any restriction? Do you see, is this application is able to communicate with the database? If you see, yes. Now you can verify. You can verify by going inside that pod also. If you have a curl, you don't have a curl, let me add a curl package using APK. Now using curl also, if you do inside the pod, that Mongo SVC 27017, is it able to communicate? Do you see? Is it able to communicate with the database pod using service by default? Yes. Now, if I create a network policies now, if I create a network policy like this, default deny in that namespace. Now, do you think does that application can communicate with this application? This is like a default deny. Do you think the moment I create this network policy in that namespace, since I have not used any pod selector, I have not given where to allow from where to reject. So is it like a default deny? Now let me apply this in that namespace. Default deny. There is a network policy in the test namespace. There is a network policy in the test namespace now. There is a network policy, netpol you can execute. or network policy. Now there is a network policy in the test namespace. That is kind of a default deny. Now you see, this application. Now you access this application. I am getting kind of that page, but there is no data. It will not allow because you are blocking that default. Now if I go inside that database, I mean to say if I go inside this application part, when I do the same curl, now do you see, is it connecting? Is it able to connect? This is kind of a default deny, right? From outside also, I'm not able to reach that application server also, that application service also, because request is going to kubeproxy. Kubeproxy is forwarding the traffic. We have a kubeproxy pod. So the kubeproxy also is able to communicate with that Spring application. It is forwarding the traffic to that Spring application. Am I getting that one also from kubeproxy? Kubeproxy is trying to communicate with that one because that is where the network traffic is going. I am not able to access that front end application, at the same back end also this Spring application is not reachable with this database. Now kind of a default deny. Now I don't want this default deny. Can I allow something like this only for this one, only for this pod? I want to apply this rule like match labels, app mango, policy type ingress. In the ingress policy type, can I define something like this? On this port it will allow, it should allow something like this. Can I define my policy like this? If the request is coming from this pod, then only it will allow. If the request is coming from any other pod, will it allow on this port? Now I'll create a policy like this. I'll change that policy like this. Instead of default deny, I'll delete that. Default deny. Now instead of default deny, I'll do something like this. I'll do something like this. I'll create a network policy, something like this. Something like this I'll create. Now this is in same namespace. This is applicable for a pod which has this label, and it will allow for the pod which has this label. Now let me apply that network policy. Now you go inside your pod just for testing purpose. You go same pod, you go inside that same pod. Now you do the curl. Now do you see, this time is it allowed from that pod? Is this allowed from this application pod? Is it able to communicate with the database pod using that service? Yes. Now for time being, let me create one temporary pod. Let me create one temporary pod. That Nginx pod I'll create. I'll create that Nginx pod in the same namespace, test namespace. Now I'll go inside that Nginx pod. I'll go inside that Nginx pod. I'll go inside that Nginx pod. kubectl, kubectl. I'll go inside this Nginx pod. Now if I do simple curl, the telnet test, do you think that does that Nginx pod will be able to communicate with the database pod? I have a bash or ss, that doesn't matter. kubectl, there is a typo. Now I'll go inside that Nginx pod. I have a curl. If I say curl telnet, that same whatever I have done, mongo svc colon 27017. Now do you see, is it allowing from this Nginx pod, is it allowed to communicate with the database, the database pod because of this network policy? Now it is only allowed from the pods which has this label. Instead of pod level, I can give at a namespace level also. Otherwise, can I give something like this? Can I allow for that pod also? Something like this. Pod selector. app nginx. Suppose that pod has this label. Now can I do something like this, which will allow? Yes. Let me show that. Let me show that. Let me change my network policies. Let me change my network policy. Now here I'll allow for other pod also like this. Pod selector, match labels, app, but make sure you are using a correct labels. Again, if you are using not improper, incorrect labels, again it will not work. App nginx I am using. This is my pod label. So this pod has this label, app nginx. This I am using in my network policies like this. Now let me apply that network policy. Let me apply that network policy and try now. Now let me go inside that same nginx pod. Now let me do that. Now do you see? Is it working now after changing the network policies? So this way we can apply at a pod level. This way we can apply at a pod level. Now if I want to apply at a namespace level, let me create some other pod. Let me create some other pod in a default namespace or any other namespace. Instead of pod selector here, can I use this way, namespace selector? Instead of name pod selector, can I use a namespace selector and match labels? Can I give a labels whatever I have added on the namespace? So that is it going to allow from all the pods which are in that namespace? Yes. So that is how it works. Is everyone clear? What is this network policies, how it works? Sometimes you are going to use all these things based on the requirement. I am trying to cover all the use cases, all the topics which are there in Kubernetes. Based on the requirement, you can use all these things. But do you have, do you think these are like a useful concepts? I mean to say, kind of a best practices which we will follow so that we can restrict the access to the databases from other pods, other applications, even though they are running in a same Kubernetes cluster. Can I consider this network policies like a firewalls at a pod level, kind of a firewalls at a pod level, these network policies? Yes. Thank you guys. That's it for today. Tomorrow, I'm going to start with EKS, managed Kubernetes cluster. What is EKS? What is the problem with self-managed? What is EKS? How to set up EKS cluster? I'll continue tomorrow. Guys, by coming Saturday, the Kubernetes classes also will be done. Your batch also will be done by coming Saturday. By max 20th, we will be completing your batch, or maybe if not 20th, it will be 21st. So by 21st, all other Kubernetes and pending topics like Prometheus, Grafana, Helm, RBAC, all these things will be done by 20th or 21st. So by next weekend, your batch as well as Kubernetes also will be completed. Thank you guys. That's it for today. We'll see you tomorrow.